Let me ask you something. When you picture America, what do you see? Probably a busy city, a college campus, maybe a suburb with a Costco 2 exits away, a place where things more or less work. That version absolutely exists, but for every thriving neighborhood you can name, there is a town, a real town with real people and real history that has been quietly coming apart for decades. And most of us scroll right past it. Today, we are not doing that. We are counting down 10 American towns that are genuinely, measurably losing hope, not because the people gave up, because forces far bigger than any individual, any mayor, any city council decided these places were expendable. Let's go. Number 10. Paradise, California. Let's start with a name that is almost too cruel to be real. Paradise. The town of Paradise, California. If you were a screenwriter pitching this story, somebody in the room would tell you the name was too on the nose. And yet, on the morning of November 8th, 2018, a transmission line owned by PG&E ignited dry brush in the foothills of Butte County, and within hours, the place called Paradise was gone. The campfire became the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history. 85 people lost their lives. Over 18,000 buildings were reduced to ash. And a community of more than 26,000 people was essentially erased from the map in a single morning. By the 2020 census, Paradise had just 4,764 residents, a staggering 81.8% drop from the decade before. Just let that sink in. More than 4 out of every 5 people who called that place home no longer do. Now, here's where it gets both inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time. A lot of survivors genuinely want to come back. They love that community with a fierce, stubborn loyalty that honestly deserves more respect than it gets. But the insurance market in California's fire risk zones has essentially collapsed. Major insurers have fled the state. No insurance means no mortgage. No mortgage means you cannot rebuild even if you want to. So thousands of people who survived one of the worst natural disasters in modern American history are now stuck in bureaucratic quicksand, and the system that was supposed to protect them is the same system that is keeping them out. The median age of those who have returned sits around 60. The retirees, the ones who refuse to let the fire have the last word, that stubbornness is genuinely admirable. But it also means Paradise is rebuilding without its own future. The young families, the workforce, the kids they left, and in a state where fire seasons grow longer every year, you have to wonder how many times a town can be asked to start over before it simply runs out of tries. Number 9. Bluefield, West Virginia. Not every decline looks like a disaster movie. Some towns just fade, slowly, steadily, quietly, like a porch light left on for someone who stopped coming home. Bluefield, West Virginia is that kind of story. Sitting on the Virginia border, it spent much of the 20th century as a reliable coal country hub. Nothing glamorous, nobody was flying into Bluefield for a luxury vacation, but it was solid, real, a place where you could work hard, raise a family, and know your neighbors by name. That is not nothing. That is actually everything. Then coal collapsed, and Bluefield went with it. By 2020, the population sat at just under 9,700, down from around 10,400 inches, 2010. Median household income is roughly $39,000, and about 1 in 5 residents lives in poverty. But what really stings came in 2023, when Bluefield Regional Medical Center shut down. The hospital, gone. In a region where generations of coal miners dealt with black lung and serious physical toll, residents now drive a significant distance to reach emergency care. That is not an inconvenience. For older residents or anyone in a genuine medical emergency, that distance carries consequences no one should have to accept. The young people with options are leaving for Beckley, for Charleston, for anywhere with job postings that do not require a long drive just to see a doctor. And when young people leave, the tax base shrinks, services get worse, and more people want to leave. Bluefield has been in that spiral for a long time. Number 8. Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown used to be one of the most productive cities in the world. That is not an exaggeration. In the 1930s and 1940s, this northeastern Ohio city had more than 170,000 residents and was churning out steel that literally built American infrastructure. People came from across the globe to work here. It was loud, grimy, and alive in a way that made people proud to be part of it. Then came the 19th of September, 1977, Black Monday. That was the day Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced it was closing. 5,000 workers lost their jobs in a single announcement. Not over time, not with a safety net. One announcement and 5,000 lives upended. By 2020, Youngstown had just over 60,000 residents and a poverty rate of approximately 37%, one of the highest for any city its size in the country. Median household income sits around $34,000. Tens of thousands of housing structures stand vacant, and the city has been running demolition programs for decades just trying to keep up with the abandonment. Then in 2024, the Stewart Healthcare Hospital closed too, because apparently once is not enough. What makes Youngstown so hard to sit with is that the people there know exactly what they lost and exactly when they lost it. The grandchildren of steelworkers are growing up in a city still defined by something their grandparents built, surrounded by the wreckage of its collapse, and being asked to create something new without the tools that made the original possible. Number 7. Camden, New Jersey. You can see Philadelphia from Camden literally. Just look across the Delaware River. And somehow, that proximity has not helped Camden one bit. If anything, being in the shadow of a bigger, more powerful neighbor may have made things harder. Because why invest in Camden when Philadelphia is right there? Camden in its prime was a genuine industrial force, shipbuilding, manufacturing, you name it. Campbell's Soup was born there. Walt Whitman spent his final years there and is buried there. For generations, Camden was a place where a working-class family could build something real. Then the factories left, and what remained was concentrated poverty that became almost self-perpetuating. By 2020, Camden had about 71,800 residents, a poverty rate around 30%, and a median income of roughly $40,000. The public school system has been under direct state control for so long that there are adults who went through the entire Camden school system without ever experiencing locally controlled education. And the crime, at its peak in the early 2010s, Camden's homicide rate exceeded 60 per 100,000 residents. The national average hovers around 6 or 7. The city made the dramatic decision in 2013 to disband its entire police department and rebuild it under county control. Crime has improved meaningfully since then, and that is a real accomplishment. But restructuring law enforcement does not fix generational poverty, and generational poverty is still very much present. Camden is trying hard, and that deserves genuine recognition. But trying hard and breaking free of structural decline are two very different things. Number 6. Gary, Indiana. If you want to understand what it looks like when a city outlives its economic purpose, drive through Gary, Indiana. You will see theaters that once hosted American music legends standing open to the sky with their roofs caved in. Neighborhoods where the houses are gone, but the sidewalks still run between empty lots, leading precisely nowhere. Gary peaked at around 178,000 residents in 1960. Today, it has about 69,000. That is a loss of more than 100,000 people over 6 decades. And the city looks every single bit of it. U.S. Steel did not just employ Gary, U.S. Steel invented Gary. The company built the city at the turn of the 20th century specifically to serve its operations, making it about as pure a company town as ever existed in America. When the steel industry restructured and scattered its production globally, Gary had almost nothing else to stand on. By 2020, roughly 1 in 3 residents lived in poverty. Some neighborhoods had vacancy rates approaching 1/3 of all housing units. And the tax base had eroded so badly that basic services like working streetlights became genuine luxuries. Gary also has a famous native son. Michael Jackson was born there. The city leans into that connection with understandable pride, but there is a quietly painful irony that the most famous person to come from Gary spent his entire adult life as far from it as possible. Number 5. Benton Harbor, Michigan. There is a specific, suffocating quality to poverty at the 40% level. When nearly half your neighbors are living below the federal poverty line, it is not just a statistic, it is the texture of daily life. It shapes what your schools look like, what healthcare you can reach, whether the streetlights work. In Benton Harbor, Michigan, roughly 40% of residents live in poverty. The median household income is around $31,000. Meaningful outside investment has essentially stopped coming. Then in 2019, residents discovered their water had a lead contamination problem. Sound familiar? It should. Flint is just up the road, and the lesson from Flint apparently did not travel far enough. Benton Harbor's crisis generated some national headlines, sparked some outrage, and then faded from the news cycle. The people still living there do not have the luxury of moving on. The population dropped nearly 10% between 2010 and 2020, from just over 10,000 to about 9,100. The people with means leave first. Those who stay are disproportionately those with the fewest options, and that concentration of vulnerability in distressed places is one of the least discussed injustices in American life. Number 4. East St. Louis, Illinois. We have been talking about cities that lost 10 or 15% of their populations over a decade. East St. Louis lost 31.6% between 2010 and 2020 alone. Not over a century of slow decline. 1 decade. It went from 27,000 people to just over 18,400. And that is stacked on top of decades of prior losses, going back to when the meatpacking, rail, and aluminum industries packed up and left without much of a goodbye. The median household income today sits in the range of $26,000 to $28,000. The poverty rate is around 32%. Some neighborhood surveys have found vacancy rates approaching 25% of all housing entire blocks standing empty. More properties than the remaining population can possibly occupy or maintain, even if they wanted to. The per capita rate of violent incidents in East St. Louis has frequently ranked among the highest in the country, which is not a coincidence when you understand the poverty and vacancy producing it. Fiscal strain is so severe that maintaining basic municipal services has been a persistent struggle. What makes East St. Louis especially painful is that it has largely been treated as someone else's problem for so long that the region has simply normalized its decline. Number 3. Flint, Michigan. Flint would be a story of industrial collapse, even if the water had been perfectly fine. General Motors employment in the Flint region went from roughly 80,000 workers at its peak to a fraction of that today. Population dropped from over 102,000 inches 2010 to around 81,250 by 2020, more than 20% in a single decade. The poverty rate sits around 34%. Thousands of homes have been demolished in ongoing blight programs, and thousands more still stand vacant. Violent crime rates have remained historically elevated. Flint was already dealing with the kind of long-term industrial collapse that would define any city's identity for generations. And then came the water. In 2014, to save money, state-appointed emergency managers switched Flint's water supply to the Flint River without applying the corrosion controls required to keep the water safe. The river water ate through aging pipes. Lead leached directly into taps across an entire city. Children were poisoned. Families cooked with it, bathed in it, gave it to their babies because the government told them repeatedly and falsely it was fine. By the time federal intervention arrived in 2016, Flint had become a national symbol of what happens when a city becomes so politically expendable that the most basic obligation of government gets treated as optional. Flint is fighting back with genuine toughness, but it is fighting from a hole that took generations to dig, and the people who dug it faced remarkably few real consequences. Number 2. Detroit, Michigan. In 1950, Detroit was the 4th largest city in the United States, with 1.85 million residents and a swagger that matched its size. This was the city that put America on wheels. The city that invented the assembly line as a way of life. The city where a man with a strong back and a willingness to work could walk into a factory, negotiate a union contract, buy a house, send his kids to a good school, and build something real. That was not a dream. For hundreds of thousands of families, black families, white families, immigrant families, that was Tuesday. By 2020, Detroit had approximately 639,000 people, a loss of more than 1 million residents over 70 years. The poverty rate is around 32%. Median income sits near $39,000. Upward of 30,000 structures are estimated to be vacant or abandoned. And in 2013, Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in United States history, with debts exceeding $18 billion. The city that built the cars that built the country ended up broke. What happened to Detroit is not mysterious, and it is not simple. Auto restructuring stripped away the jobs. Redlining and discriminatory housing policy pushed black residents into neighborhoods that were then systematically underinvested. Highways built in the 1950s and 60s demolished thriving communities to serve suburban commuters. White flight gutted the tax base. Decades of fiscal mismanagement made everything worse. There are real signs of life in Detroit today: genuine investment, cultural pride, a downtown that has come back. But that revival has been uneven in ways that matter enormously, and a city that once held nearly 2 million people is still working out who it is now. Number 1. Huntington, West Virginia. On a single afternoon in August of 2016, emergency services in Huntington responded to 26 opioid overdoses in 4 hours. 26. 4 hours. One city. That moment gave a lot of Americans their first real look at what the opioid epidemic had already been quietly doing to communities like this one for years. Cabell County was documented as having one of the highest opioid overdose death rates anywhere in the United States. Not adjusted for anything. Just one of the highest, full stop. And here's the twist. Huntington does not have the worst raw numbers on this list. Population decline of 4.7% looks modest next to Detroit. Poverty at 26% is serious, but not the ceiling we have seen today. Median income around $45,000 is actually higher than several cities on this countdown. So why is it number 1? Because Huntington is not just an economic story, it is something darker and more deliberate. Coal and manufacturing decline created a vacuum of despair. Pharmaceutical distributors filled that vacuum with pills. Cabell County alone received over 81 million opioid tablets in 8 years. For a county of roughly 96,000 people, that works out to about 900 pills per person. Federal lawsuits confirmed these companies had the data, saw what was happening, and kept shipping anyway. That is not a market, that is a decision. You can count the foster care placements and the first responders now carrying overdose reversal medication as standard equipment. But you cannot count the erosion of trust, the accumulated grief, or the way tragedy stops feeling like news after it happens enough times. Huntington has become a genuine national model for addiction treatment, and the people there are fighting harder than most cities ever have to. But the best treatment program in the world cannot fully close a hole that economics dug. Fighting an epidemic on top of structural collapse is like fixing a roof in a hurricane. Possible, necessary, and not something any community should ever have to do alone. Behind every number we covered today, every closed hospital, every empty house, every family that left there is a real American story. The cookouts, the Friday night games, the neighbors who still wave. In our last video, we talked about the loneliest towns in America. But some towns aren't just lonely, they're slowly losing their footing. What happens next depends on whether anyone is still paying attention. If this mattered to you, hit like so the algorithm knows Globe Wisp exists. Subscribe for more stories the headlines ignore. And comment below which town stayed with you. Because these places are still fighting.